Hello, this is Mouse Gunner, and welcome to Blood Bowl 2. This video is going to continue a series of tutorials covering the rules and strategy of Blood Bowl. In this video in particular, we're going to be going over building your first team. Now, I've already built one team in the game, but let's go ahead and choose to create a new team so you guys can see the process from the beginning. So the first choice you're going to have to make, and this can be one of the more difficult choices, is which race you're going to make your team. Now, this choice is going to determine not only the composition of the team, but also more than likely skew you in a particular style of play based off of that composition. So this can be quite a confusing choice, especially considering how many races there are in the game. And this is not all the races that are available in the original source material either. And there are planned DLCs that will be coming out as time passes that will more than likely be adding teams on. So this decision will become more and more confusing as more and more teams are available. So thankfully, the game itself does a good job of telling you the strengths, weaknesses, and skill level of each team. I personally recommend to start with either the human team or the orc team, as they are both low in the skill level and they are pretty flexible teams. If we talk about the human team, now this team has the lowest of the skill levels that I've seen so far. It's one of the easier teams to start with as a new player, and honestly, I highly recommend it. One of the main strengths of this team is its flexibility. It can pretty much play a lot of the different aspects of the game. If you want to play more physical style, it can do it. It might not have the same advantages as some teams that are geared toward that kind of physical play. And that's kind of the weakness of this team, is it can meet all of the different aspects of the game. You can play a strong offensive game. You can play a strong physical game. But teams that are actually designed for that style of play will have advantages over you. Some of the things that it also says is that the strengths of this team are based upon skills rather than stats, and that is very much true. Now, that can be overcome by leveling up certain players, but that is going to be a weakness further into the game, as it is a little bit harder to overcome a stats deficit. It can be overcome eventually. I guess in the beginning of the game is what I meant to say there, is that a stat deficit can kind of be hard to overcome initially, but as you level up your characters, you can overcome it. That's kind of what I meant to say there. So, that's kind of the big strength of a human team. Now, the orc team is similar to the human team in that it is pretty flexible, but it does have more of a leaning towards the more physical style play. So you're going to have some players that start with a stats bonus in strength, but it can be a little bit trickier to play with this team because of that more of a leaning stance towards that more physical play. But it's still a decently easy team to pick up. And the other thing that it says here, weakness-wise, and I should point out, is that leaning towards the more physical style play, the sacrifice that you make is that you don't really have many agile players. So the offensive side of the game, scoring, which is how you win the game, suffers a little bit because you don't have clear role players like the human team has, like a catcher. You do have a thrower, but although goblins can kind of fill that role, they're not really meant for it necessarily. So that's the kind of the strengths and weaknesses of the orc team. It has that flexibility where it can play an offensive style game. I mean, you can use goblins as catchers or receivers, however you want to describe them. But you can also play a more physical style. And for somebody that wants that kind of stance and is a newer player, this is a great team for you. Now, the dwarf team has a maxed out skill level. This is 5 stars. And there's a number of reasons for that. Dwarf players are slow. They have very low movement stats. And this can be quite a disadvantage. If a team is able to make a hole in your line, they can very easily break through and outrun you. And that's a big problem. That's one of the reasons why this skill level is as high as it is. Also, this team is very dependent on skills. They start with a lot of skills. All their players will start with some skill. But they don't really have the stats to match it. The only real, what I would call strong player in the team is the Death Roller here, which is a very limited use kind of player. The Troll Slayers can be high-strength units, but it's very much dependent upon a die roll. So most of the time, you're going to be evenly matched or in a deficit as far as stats go with this team. But a lot of the skills that this team have can make up for that. But there's going to be some matchups that you do pretty well against, and there's going to be some matchups that you struggle against. But every matchup can be a challenge, which is the reason why the skill level is as high as it is. But if you're a very experienced player and you know how to play dwarves, this can be a very challenging opponent in that instance because of all of the advantages as far as skills and everything that this team has. This is a very good team to run out the clock with, play a more delaying, defensive-minded style. But due to that very one-dimensional style of play, adds to that difficulty. This is not really a quick scoring team. This is not really a team that you're going to be throwing the ball very much. So very one-dimensional style of play. So that's what adds to a lot of the challenge. Now, the Skaven team is one of the first agility-based teams. Now, one of the sacrifices that a lot of the agility-based teams make, and this is one of the reasons why this is a higher skill level team or a 3-star team, is that most agile players are fragile. They will be injured easily, and this is true of the Skaven team for the most part. Their armor value stat is going to be a little bit lower than the norm. But one of the big advantages they have is foot speed. Some of their characters, and it says here, a true running team, their foot speed is phenomenal. They can get across the field at amazing pace. You can very easily do, 2-turn scores with this team all day long. Also, that agility allows them to dodge through tackle zones, so they don't really need to play a more physical style of strategy, which honestly is a disadvantage for them. They do have some players like the Rat Ogre that can match, stronger, more physical teams. But for the most part, you have team members that are fragile. You don't really want to be getting hit a lot and having to make those armor rolls because your players might get injured, and that's really a problem. Also, another weakness it says is the gutter runners are so valuable for the offensive side of your play because they're the ones that have all that foot speed, that if you lose them as casualties, it can be real detrimental to that style of play. If I remember correctly, they also have a strength detriment as well. The gutter runners, usually speaking, for instance, the human team, the catchers, they have good foot speed, and they also have some skills that help them in the offensive role, but they lose some in strength, and I think gutter runners are another example of that. So they only have 2 strength, which will put them at a disadvantage against most teams. So those are weak players that you really don't want to be in the front lines. But that's pretty much how the Skaven play. This is one of those teams, if you want to play a strong offensive team that is all about scoring, this can be a team you can play as. Just keep in mind that the higher skill level is going to be, a lot of that is going to be the fact that your players are a little bit more fragile, which is not really something you want to encounter very much as a new player. You don't want to see a lot of injuries and deaths on your squad. That kind of puts a not so great feeling for you if you're just trying to learn the game. Now, High Elves are another strong offensive style team. Now the Skaven is much more a running type team, although they can play the throwing game if they want. The High Elves are all about the throwing game, the passing game, and it says so here in their strengths. They do have decent armor values, though. This is one thing, as I said, usually the Agile teams suffer in this regard. This is one of the teams that's a good Agile team, but they're a little bit more sturdy than the other teams that are agility-based. But they do suffer a little bit more in the physical style of play. And they don't start with a lot of the skill bonuses that you might get from somebody of the cost of a team like this. Teams like Dwarves and High Elves, each individual player is very expensive. it can be very difficult to have more than just the very minimum level of players to put on the field. So getting more than 11 players can be pretty difficult. So those two things can make them kind of difficult to play with. The fact that they're not geared for a more physical style of gameplay, and the fact that they're pretty expensive, and it says here cash can get tight if you have to replace players. That is a real problem with the high elf team. But again, if you're talking about 2-turn score, high elf teams can do that all day long, and if you're not playing an opponent that can really deal with the passing game, this team can dominate. Now, Dark Elves are very similar to High Elves, and they also have a similar skill level. And that is due to the fact that they are very similarly set up. But rather than play the passing game, they play the running game, which is actually a downside for them. They don't have the skills that make the passing game a viable choice. So you're going to have to end up running. Kind of a description for the Dark Elves is they could play the passing game, but they just choose not to out of spite. But in any case, they have good mobility, just as the High Elves do. But their style of play is a little bit different. They kind of have skills that make them geared more towards a physical style of play. You have things like the assassins, which can attack players, and they also, the assassins have kind of two strengths. They can use their stab skill to try and down opponents that are a little bit tougher, but they can also use their, I forget what the skill is called. I think it's called shadowing or something like that. Let's see. It's called, shadowing. This skill allows them to follow around a player, so if somebody leaves their tackle zone, they get to follow after them. This is a good player to put on enemy catchers, to keep a tackle zone on them. They try and dodge out, you just follow them. So that's, it's a good way of shutting down the offense of the opposing team, the assassins. And you also have unique players like the Witch Elves. Now, this player has a lot of unique skills, like Frenzy and Jump Up, that make it a strong physical style player. But the downside of that is its stats are more towards agility, not strength. So you don't really have the stats to back up the skills. And that's why this can be a high skill level team. If you really know what you're doing, you could take advantage of some of the strong suits of this team. But I honestly think that the Dark Elves take a little bit more skill than the High Elves. I would say it's maybe marginal, but because the High Elves have a more clearly defined role, a more clearly defined playing style, they can be a little bit easier to understand, whereas the Dark Elves can take a little bit of experience playing with their team to kind of figure out where their players' roles are and figure out how to use them more effectively. Now, the Bretonnian team is a team that I have no knowledge of, because this was not in the original source material unless they've added it in more recently. But since I've played the tabletop game, this was never really a team. Now, I've taken a little bit of a look at them, and it seems like they're like a modified human team that doesn't really have the offensive flexibility that a normal human team would have. So you have some low-priced linemen. So it can be easier to fill out a roster. They're a little bit more physical leaning because you're depending upon the blitzers much more. Now, blitzers can be very powerful characters in the human team, but this team really doesn't have things like catchers or other skilled players to depend upon. So the blitzers are the main strength of this team. But the blitzers are expensive, and they're so important. If you start losing them as casualties, that can be a problem. And I think the linemen are a little bit less durable than the linemen that are in a normal human team. So although they're cheap, they're easier to injure. So if you're playing against a more physically oriented team, you can really get bashed up. And also, you really don't have stats bonuses in your favor. You don't really have much in the way of strength. You don't have much in the way of agility to make your team more flexible or really have I mean, you're more physical leaning, but you're not really that strong in that. So if you're facing a team that is much more oriented toward that physical style of play, you might be at a disadvantage. So I think that's why this has a little bit more of a skill level with 3 stars. But again, my experience with the Bretonnians is limited because they are a newer team to Blood Bowl. Now, Chaos are one of the very much physically oriented teams, and this could be one of the more fun teams to play with the physical orientation. That skill level is also lower because they're so good at that physical style of play. And they also do have room for a lot of flexibility later down the road as you gain levels with characters, as you have access to mutations and things like that. That can give you a lot of flexibility and make your team much more versatile. Maybe early on you won't have that flexibility, but later on you can be a strong offensive presence as well as a strong physical team. So this team can be very good later on in the game as you gain experience. But early on, you're going to be very much more physically oriented. You have some very strong players. And you also, even your most basic characters, the Beastmen, have bonuses that can potentially make them strong because they have the Horn skill, which when they blitz with, they can get up to a strength 4. So they can overmatch a lot of players, even with their lowest value team members. And then you also have the Minotaur, which can really wreak havoc on the opposing teams. This is one of the most powerful big men in the game because his downsides aren't as big as some of the other big men's downsides. But it can really, this can be something that when you're playing a Chaos team, you really worry about that Minotaur and what it's going to do. But as far as the weaknesses go, you don't really have much going for you as far as skills go in the beginning of the game, and you're not nearly as flexible early on as well. So playing with the ball, not that great. Players like the Minotaur, you might be like, well, just give the Minotaur the ball and run it. Well, he doesn't have the agility to really use the ball. If he can get the ball, that's great. People are going to have a hard time getting it out of his hands, but getting it to him is going to be difficult. And otherwise, you're going to have to rely on your Beastmen to do a lot of the offensive scoring, and they're not really geared for that. And also, being a big man, any big man has that possibility that they won't do what you want them to do. And your Minotaur, because he's so powerful and such a key element of this team early on, if he doesn't do what you want him to do, it can really screw your strategy up quite a bit. So that can be one of the things that make this team kind of difficult to play, but it is one of the most successful physically oriented teams. So if you want to play a physical style of play, Chaos Team can be what you're looking for. Because made for brutally murdering foes, as they say here. Okay, moving along. Now, these are the DLC unlocked teams that are available right now. So you have the Wood Elves. Now, I don't know if I necessarily agree with the skill level that they have here because I can see why they gave it the skill level, but honestly, the same problems you're going to have with a High Elf team, you're going to have with a Wood Elf team, except Wood Elves are not nearly as durable as High Elves are. High Elves have better armor values. Wood Elves don't. And that's the big thing. They're a much more agility-based team and scoring offensive-style team. But the compromise for that is that a lot of their players don't have very good armor values. But you do have players like the Treant here that are very strong presence on the field. They do have the Treant, although it's very strong, has a big downside. If it takes root, which is a skill that it has, where there's a chance every time you try and play with it, that it just gets stuck in the spot it's in, and it will remain there until the next stoppage of play, which can be a huge penalty for this player. Seeing how key he is as a player, not being able to use him much once he takes root can be a real big problem, especially another problem with this player is very slow movement speed. So it can be really difficult to use this player where you need him. But the best place to put him, really, honestly, is in the front line and kind of keep him there. Otherwise, nice scoring team. A lot of the same advantages the High Elf team has. Good passing play. Can dodge through a lot of tackle zones. But you still have some of the same disadvantages. High-priced players, and that fragility is a big problem. So not a physically oriented team. You can do some physical play with the tree men, but not with really many of your other players. Maybe the war dancers can do a little bit physical play as well, but that can be a pretty significant weakness for this team, is getting bashed up. And if you're playing a team like the Chaos team, they're going to try and put you in the ground or injured. So you're going to really have to look out for that. Now, the Lizardmen are kind of unique because they play a lot differently than a lot of the other teams. They have players that are very weak but are very mobile and agile and can be an offensive presence. But due to that weakness, low strength values, low armor values, they're very vulnerable and fragile. So if you're playing against this team, one of your main aims, and I know the skill level says 2, but again, I don't agree with that. I would say probably more a 3, because you have to think a little bit differently with this team. But if you're playing against this team, you aim for the skinks, because the skinks are their offensive presence. They're also weak and fragile, so if you injure a lot of them, put them out of the game, the Lizardmen are now at a numerical disadvantage. So although the Sauruses, which are these kind of bigger guys, are very strong, and they also have a decent movement speed, if I remember correctly, one problem they have is they're not very agile. The other Lizardmen players, the Saurus and the Croxagore, have agilities of 1, which make them not really able to do much with the ball at all. So all of your offensive potential depends upon the skinks, which have a very high movement value as well, and they have dodge skill and everything like that. They're your strong offensive presence, but their weakness is a liability. The Saurus players are strong. They have good movement values, but that agility pretty much means that once they get in a tackle zone, unless they bash their way out of it, they're stuck for the rest of the game, and that can be a liability. Now, you also have a big man, the Croxagore, which is slightly stronger, but it still has the same problem. Agility is at 1, so once you're in a tackle zone, you're pretty much there. And you also have the downsides that you have with a lot of other big men, not doing what you want them to do when you need them to do things. So that's a lot of the upsides and downsides. So the Lizardmen can be a really good team if you know how to play them, but they can also be a team that can be taken advantage of if you know how to play against them. And for that reason, I would probably uprate the skill level up to a 3, but that's my own personal opinion. But the Croxagore is a very powerful big guy, and you have, because you can have up to 6 Saurus players on the team, you can have a lot of high-strength players on this team. But as a result, this team kind of plays a little bit like an Ogre team. Ogres aren't in the game yet, but Ogres play kind of similarly, except it's much more of an extreme. Ogres are stronger than Saurus is, but they have the same problems that all big men have. And then the Snotlings that play with them are kind of like Skinks, but even more of a disadvantage. First off, they don't have the foot speed that the Skinks have, but they also are even weaker and more fragile. So that's kind of the Lizardmen wrapped up, and that gives us all the teams that are currently in the game. So that's a lot of explanation of the races, but honestly, it's worth mentioning because this choice here is going to determine a lot about what your team is and how it plays. I'm going to play with a human team here, or build a human team here, because I think this is one of the best starting choices for a beginning player, and it's purely because of that flexibility. So let's go ahead and select the human team. Now this is where you're going to have to enter a name. You're going to have to enter a unique name, I've kind of noticed. I think what they're doing with this game is if somebody else already has a team name something somewhere in the game world, you don't get to choose it. So if I type in poop, and I've already tried this, and try and hit next, it says this team name is already used because somebody else beat me to using poop as a team name. So you kind of get the idea. So we'll just call this because I'm assuming nobody's chosen that yet. You get to choose a team motto, and this can really be anything, is, you know, whatever you want. So, you know, don't hit me there. And, you know, whatever you want to type in here. Let's do proper here. Let's capitalize the and give ourselves another exclamation point. There you go. Then you get to choose a team logo. Now, I think the ones that start with these little markers here are already existing teams, like the Reichland Reavers and what have you. So if you want to choose something a little bit different, you want to go up to one of these choices here. So we'll choose, I think that you get to letters eventually. But, you know, there's kind of a wide assortment of different logos you can choose. But obviously, the A team is going to start with an A, right? Then you get to choose how your team jerseys are going to look. And some of these are already existing teams. But then eventually you start getting into things, you know, and whatever you think looks nice. Let's go with this kind of orange hue because it looks like it goes with the logo a little bit. And then we go on to the next part. This is where you choose your stadium. And they're pretty much basic. So you've got like your normal human style stadium. Nagaroth is like a Dark Elf stadium. World Edge Mountains is Dwarf. Skaven. Badlands is Orc. And that's pretty much it so far in the game. So, a stadium. And then we hit create. This is going to build most of our team. Now at this point, it's gonna ask you if you want the assistants to build your team for you. Well, that's not what we're going to do in this video because we're trying to explain how you build a team. So we'll hit no. But if you're really new to this and you just want to let the AI do it for you, you can hit yes. Okay, now with every starting team, you're going to start with 1,000,000 gold. And you can spend this however you want. But usually speaking, you're going to have a basic player like a lineman. Now, usually speaking, the linemen are your most generic members of your race. They may not have much in the way of skills, at least with human teams you don't. But some teams, the linemen may have skills. Now, not all teams will have a player called a lineman. They might be called something else, but usually you can figure out what your kind of base character is. Usually speaking, it's going to be the cheapest player available to your team. So in this case, we see that this player is 50,000 apiece. We go over to the catcher, 70,000, thrower, 70,000, blitzer is 90,000. Then we have our ogre, which is 130,000. Usually speaking, a lot of teams, not all teams, but a lot of teams have a big man. A big man. The big men are going to be the most expensive player on the team. So to do a very generic setup, what I recommend starting with is a couple catchers for your offensive punch, at least one thrower so that you can get the ball to the catchers, a couple blitzers for your more defensive beat-em-up players. Now, there are limits to how many players of particular types you can have on your team. You can have no more than 16 players, but certain specialty players, like, for instance, the linemen, no limit. You can have up to 16 of these guys. If you want to make a team completely consisting of linemen, you can do that. You will be at a disadvantage because linemen don't really have a particular strength, but they also, with human teams, don't really have a weakness either. But that might be a very hard team to play with because your players aren't going to really be they're not going to be really set up for physical style play, and they're not going to really be set up for offensive style play. So, what are you going to do? Now, catchers, you have a limit of only being able to have 4 maximum. Blitzers, also 4 maximum. Throwers, 2 maximum. And the big men usually are only going to be allowed to have 1. But there are some teams that allow you to have 2. I think Wood Elves is an instance of that, where you can have 2 treemen. So we'll pick up an ogre for our more physical punch as well. And now we have all our specialty players. Let's go ahead and fill up the team. Now, you're going to want to have a minimum of 11 players. That's what a full fielding of the team would consist of 11 players. So there we have 11 players. Now, we could do more than that, but you also have to consider that there are going to be other things that you're going to need to purchase. So you have 230,000 left. Let's confirm our purchase now. We can always come back and buy more players if we want, but once we confirm our purchase, we're pretty much stuck with these players. All right, now we're on our next part, and this is going to be your staff. Now, team reroll is a very valuable thing, and one thing that I've noticed, and there are some differences between the base Blood Bowl game, the tabletop game, and this game, and one of those differences I've noticed is that team rerolls cost 50,000 regardless of team, where that is not the case in the tabletop game. In the tabletop game, some teams have less expensive team rerolls, and some teams have more expensive team rerolls. Team rerolls simulate how well your team works together. And certain teams are a little bit easier to coach than other teams. So that's why some teams, team rerolls are more expensive than other teams. Usually speaking, human teams, at least in the original tabletop game, would be the normal base 50,000. They're not really having a disadvantage or an advantage. A team like a dwarf, the dwarves, would have a less expensive team reroll because they're a little bit better as a coordinated team. And it also balances out the fact that they're more expensive per player to build. Not so much in this game, though. In this game, from what I've seen, building dwarves, it's the team rerolls cost the same regardless of team. So that is a disadvantage big time for the dwarves that doesn't exist in the tabletop game. In any case, I would recommend a minimum of 2 rerolls. 3 is nice, but 2 I would say is the minimum, especially for a new player, because this is going to get you out of trouble if you make a mistake. So I'm going to choose 3 because I think that is a really good choice for a new team. Although I might only go with 2, it depends. One thing you have to keep in mind is you can buy more team rerolls later on with money you accumulate. But if this game works the same way that the original source material works, team rerolls are doubled in price after that initial team build. So this is very important to set up. An apothecary can be valuable because it gives you 1 reroll per half, if I remember correctly, for any injuries. I could be wrong with that. It could be a reroll per game. Yeah, reroll during a match. Yeah, can reroll 1 injury per match. So it's a 1-match thing, or 1-time use per match. But this allows you to reroll any injuries that happen. Now, this is one thing that I kind of... If you're going to use an apothecary, I recommend that you actually wait until it's a real injury, because you can re-roll a knocked out result. You can't re-roll a stunned result, but you can re-roll a knocked out result. I don't recommend you do that, though, because injuries are much worse for your team. Injuries can give your players negative stat bonuses. They can even kill a player. That happens, it can be a big problem for your team. This is going to be a player that's going to be a liability in the future if he's injured. Or if he's dead, you're going to have to replace him, which costs money. So if you're playing and you have an apothecary, I highly recommend that you only use it on an actual injury, not on knocked out results, because you can get back a knocked out player. You can't get back a dead player. So once you use this this apothecary, if you used it on a knockout and then later you get somebody killed by an injury, tough luck. You gotta keep the killed result. So that's why I recommend that. Now everything else here is going to affect only kickoff results. Fan Factor has a number of other effects as well. But the one thing I want to point out with Fan Factor is you can gain it just by playing matches. When you play a match, as you're progressing, your team, as your team is growing, every time you play a match, there's a chance you'll gain Fan Factor. There's also a chance you'll lose Fan Factor if you lose the match, or if it's a draw. But every time you win, there's a chance that you're going to gain Fan Factor. The lower your Fan Factor is, the more likely you'll gain Fan Factor. So it can be a strategy where you don't buy any Fan Factor to start off, because more than likely, as you play matches, you'll just keep gaining fan factor for free. So my recommendation is, if you're going to sink money into fan factor, don't sink too much. Just keep in mind that you're going to be getting those later. But coach assistant and cheerleader are going to only really affect kickoff results. So when you have those random effects that happen during a kickoff, some of those effects will be modified by either cheerleaders or coaching assistants. So maybe if you have more cheerleaders than your opponent, you get a reroll because of a random kickoff result. If you have more coaching assistants during some kickoff events, you might get a reroll or whatever the effect is. So they're very situational. So I don't know if they're really a good thing to spend money on with a starting team. Cheerleaders also have the benefit, though, of, when you score a touchdown, you have cheerleaders dance around. If you don't have cheerleaders, that doesn't happen. So it can add a little bit of fun to the game, having a cheerleader, or having cheerleaders. You also do have a limit on how many you can have, so you can't have any more than 8 rerolls. You wouldn't want any more than 8 rerolls because there's only 8 turns and a half. You get your rerolls back every half, and you can only use 1 reroll per turn. So obviously there's a limit to 8. Apothecaries, you can only have 1. Cheerleaders, you can have up to 10. Coaching assistants, you can have up to 10. And Fan Factor, you can have up to 9. Now, Fan Factor is going to have an effect on your earnings, if I remember correctly. If you have more Fan Factor, you can earn more money, which makes sense. You have more fans coming in to see you. You get more of a cut of the proceeds. So that's where that comes from in. That's where this comes in. It also will affect kickoff events as well. So it can be a more important stat than the other two. But for me, I say let's only invest a couple in this one. So I'm going to put, I'm going to get an apothecary here, and I'm going to hire a few Fan Factor. And you can consider that like paying for advertising so that you have a fan base right off the gate. All right, so we've built a team, but there are a number of things I could have done differently. But once you're done with building a team, you're going to get a team value. This value is pretty much, if you take 3 zeros off of the amount of money you spent into the team, so we had $1 million cash, we take 3 zeros off of that, now our team value is 1,000 because we spent all of it. If we had only spent, if you saw my one team, it had a team value of 970. I have 30,000 left in the coffers. My team value is 30 less, so it's 970 as a result of that. So I hope that it makes sense to you guys. But one thing that they've done to modify the rules of the game, and this is another deviance from the original tabletop game, is that any cash over 150,000 will add into your team value. So you can't have a team value any lower than 850 unless you have players die or injuries and things like that are going to lower your team value. Like for instance, if I had 0 cash and then my ogre died on me, well, he's worth 130,000, so my team value would go down by 130. But let's say I lost even more players than that, so I lost another one on top of that. Let's say a lineman. So that's a lowering of 180,000 worth of gold or 180 team value. Well, at that point, I would drop below 850. And if I didn't have any cash beyond that, that cash wouldn't be a factor. Or let's say even if I had 50,000. Well, that's not over 150,000. So it doesn't really matter. So that may be a little bit confusing, but that's not the way the original tabletop game worked. The original tabletop game, the money that you had in the bank had no impact on your team value at all. So it was a little bit less confusing, but it arguably could be taken advantage of, having a much lower team value than your opponent, and then being able to take advantage of things like inducements and things, which I'll explain in a future video how inducements work and things like that. But that's just one thing to keep in mind. So you can't purposely devalue a team if you have the cash in the bank. But from this point, if I wanted to, I could buy more players here if I had the cash to do it. Now, one thing I could have done, rather than hire more staff, so if I had not bought an apothecary, for instance, I could have bought another maybe lineman. And the main reason I would have done that is either as a backup in case somebody gets injured. Well, then I have somebody to go to the field in that instance. So I'm not at a numerical disadvantage. Another reason I might have more players than just the minimum 11, and let's say I'm kicking off the ball. Well, these catchers, they're not really set up for physical style play. So maybe if I wanted to protect them, I'd remove them from the field and I put out linemen in their place. And this can be done on any team, really, honestly. So if we back out here and we start to create another team, I'm going to go through this much quicker. And as I explained, I'm going to do a dwarf team real quick here, just to show you. This would be a team that normally... Well, actually, let's maybe do a different team. Let's do... I'm going to try and find a team that has more expensive rerolls, so you can see how that, we're not seeing that. So a chaos team would normally have more expensive rerolls. This makes sense. They're chaos. They don't really work well together. So let's do a chaos team here, and we'll see that the team rerolls, at least I think they do, cost the same for them as they do anybody else, which in the original tabletop game wouldn't have been the case. So we'll choose them. We'll enter in a name. We'll make it... I'm not going to do a motto, and we'll just make them the letter V, whatever. And... Blood Bowl 2 is fine with me. Okay, so let's hit next. All right, at this point, we would choose a stadium. So this is going to be B, and we'll go from there. We're not going to do automatic. So these are the 3 players you have to choose from if you're doing a Chaos team. You have Beastmen, you have Chaos Warriors, and you have Minotaurs. Now, the Beastmen are kind of your base player. They're 60,000 apiece. A little bit more expensive than a lineman for a human team. You have your Chaos Warriors, which are very expensive. They come in at 100,000. And then your Minotaurs come in at 150,000. So, let's build a team here. So we're going to do the maximum. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to hit buy. We're going to do the maximum of the Chaos Warriors that we're allowed, which is 4. And we're going to buy a Minotaur, maybe. We'll see. We'll buy 6 Beastmen and see how much money we have left. Okay, we can buy a Minotaur. We'll do that. It's an important element of the team. We have our minimum 11 players. We have 90,000 cash left over. So let's confirm our purchase. Now we get to the team reroll. Okay, in this case, it does cost more. Okay, that's interesting. So dwarves get screwed. Chaos, well, technically also gets screwed, but this is the way it was in the original game. So I'm just going to demonstrate here. So team rerolls, they cost 60,000 for Chaos, so we'll buy one of those, and we'll buy a few fan factors. And we've done our team. Pretty quick, not hard to do. All right, let's back out here, and we'll build yet another team, and I'll show this to you, because dwarves did have, at least as far as I understood, with what rules I have on my lap here with dwarves. Again, this could have been something that changed later. It's been a few years since I've played Blood Bowl. So ordinarily dwarves, and we'll be the C team, and we'll use W as our logo, whatever. And we'll have C Stadium. So with the Dwarf team, you have a lot more choices of players. And you have your Longbeards, which are kind of like your linemen, but they cost 70,000 apiece. So you see how they're more expensive than a lineman would be on a human team. You have your Runners, which are your more offensive-minded players. Your Blitzers, your Troll Slayer, and your Big Man, the Death Roller. So you can see how much more expensive this team is. And I'm not going to be probably able to afford a Death Roller, but let's just build the team here. So we're going to buy a couple Blitzers. That's our maximum. We're going to buy a couple Runners. That's our maximum. And then we're just going to fill up with linemen. So we have 190,000 left. We're going to confirm our purchase. But we see here team rerolls are 50,000 apiece. But according to my team rosters here, Dwarf team rerolls should be 40,000 gold apiece. So seems like some teams deviate from the original source material and some don't. So there you go with that. So just be aware that some teams are going to have more expensive rerolls and some aren't. And if you're used to the original board game, it might not necessarily follow the lines that you remember. But in any case, let's go ahead and hit done. And there we have a team. And because we didn't spend that last 40,000, we have a 960 team value team. All right. So that was a pretty lengthy video, but I think I at least tried to explain how you build a team in a lot of detail there and explaining all the different choices you have. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. This is Mouse Gunner signing out.